Welcome to the third annual Crochet Challenge for Warm Up America, sponsored by Yarnspirations, your online destination for knitting and crochet inspiration. I'm your host, Brittany, and before we get started on this beautiful design, I want to sincerely thank you for participating in this event. Your time is incredibly valuable, and I'm so grateful that you've decided to dedicate some of that time over the next few weeks to help a family in need. We're just about ready to dive into the tutorial, but before we do, I want to remind you that the pattern can be found at BHookedCrochet.com/WUA Challenge 2018. That's BHookedCrochet.com/WUA Challenge 2018. On that page, you'll also find the supplies list, instructions for the challenge, where to send your Afghan, and a link to the challenge Facebook page. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments section on that page or in the Facebook group. All right, let's get started. All right, now that you've finished crocheting all 3 of your hexagons and you've blocked them, the next thing we need to do is join them together. While we're taking a slightly less traditional route to joining these motifs together, I want them to be the central focus of the Afghan. And to do so, we need to align them point to point, like you can see right here in the motif assembly diagram. I encourage you to head over to the challenge page to find this diagram, download it and print it. It's a PDF file. You can just download it directly from that page, and you can refer to it as your roadmap so that you have a visual idea, sort of an overview of how these 3 motifs come together for the next round that we're going to demonstrate in the studio. The main thing I want you to focus your attention on right now is where we're fastening on this little map. I'll demonstrate this in the studio in just a moment, but I want you to have a visual idea of where we're starting. And taking note that this is motif number 1 that we'll be starting with. Then we have motif number 2 and motif or hexagon number 3. Now on hexagon number 1, after we fasten on, we're going to work around all 6 sides, and then we're going to pick up our second motif, work 3 of the sides. We'll pick up motif number 3, and we'll work all 6 sides. And then we just have to continue with those remaining 3 sides for motif number 2 before we join with the slip stitch to complete that first round. This is probably one of the most complicated parts of the assembly aspect of this Afghan, and I just want you to have a clear visual idea of what it's going to look like before we actually try to stitch it together. So now that you have this concept, let's go ahead and see how to work this first round, this joining round of the pattern. So we'll just go ahead and grab color B, create a slip knot, so that we can fasten on it. And I recommend starting at one of your tails here because we can use that to secure the 2 points after we have crocheted all the way around this thing. Well, what you want to do is find your first post, insert your hook there, and then place that slip knot on your hook, pull through, and chain 3. This chain 3 is going to act as a double crochet, and all we need to do for this first round, or at least around this first motif, is just make 1 double crochet into every stitch. When you get to your puff stitch, what we need to do is just make sure we're making only 1 double crochet for that stitch. So I've worked my double crochet in the post right before the puff stitch, and then I just want to find the stitch that's right on top and work my double crochet there, and then find the next post and work a double crochet into that stitch as well. That way we're not increasing, we're not decreasing, and we're going to keep our Afghan nice and flat in the process. Now when you get to your point, what we need to do is work our same pattern that we did for these previous rounds of the motif. So we're just going to make 2 double crochets, chain 2, and 2 double crochets. That way we can continue to increase just slightly, and that's going to keep our afghan nice and flat. And then we'll just continue on. Don't forget that post right there. It tends to get hidden a little bit, so you want to make sure that you're double crocheting into that stitch as well and not skipping it. And that's the repeat. We're going to do that all the way around until we get back to where we started. And that's where we're going to add in our second motif. So go ahead and finish up this round. When you've made it all the way around that first motif, we're going to pick up our second, and we're actually not going to crochet around the entire circumference of it. We're just going to hit from this point to this point over here. So just line your 2 points together. Again, I have my tail here just so I can secure these 2 points once I'm finished. And all you need to do is continue crocheting on this motif. So I'm just going to locate my first stitch that's right next to that point and work my double crochet. And you want to do this a little bit more tight than you normally would, because you want that stitch to be as tight as possible, because that's bridging the gap between this motif and this one. And then all we have to do is continue working. We're just going to make 1 double crochet into every chain, into every stitch rather. And when we get to the point, we're going to work 2 double crochets, chain 2 and 2 double crochets. And we're going to work that for only half of this motif. Then once you've made it to the opposite corner from which you originally joined this motif, then all you need to do is grab your third one, pick your point. So let's see, we'll start on the point where my tail is to keep things nice and consistent. And then I'm just going to double crochet into that first stitch right here next to the corner, just like we joined on that second one. Now the difference with this third one is that we actually want to work all the way around. We don't have another one to join, so we're going to continue making 1 double crochet into every stitch, and then for each of your corners we'll do 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet. We'll work all the way around the motif, and when we get back to this section, all we're going to do is make a double crochet into our first post right here, and then we're going to continue to double crochet around this motif, and then finally we're going to stop right here. This is going to be where we join with the slip stitch to this third chain right here to wrap up the first round. Now that we have a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like after we fill in these gaps, let's see how it's done. So the first thing I need you to do is just choose one of these little valleys. Doesn't matter which one you start with, we're going to hit all of them. So you'll locate your very last stitch over on this side here and stick your hook into that stitch. Then you'll grab color B, create your slip knot, place that loop on your hook, and then chain 1. Now we're not actually going to count this chain 1 as a stitch, but we need to do that in order to fasten the yarn on to secure it nice and tight. And what we need to do, since that chain doesn't count as a stitch, is work a single crochet into the same space. Then we're going to locate the next stitch, make a single crochet there, and the one after that we're going to single crochet. Then we're going to find the next post. We're going to completely skip that stitch and focus our attention on the one right after that. We're going to insert our hook into that stitch and slip stitch. So just grab the working yarn, pull it through the stitch and through the loop on our hook. Now that's all there is to round number 1. We'll need to chain 1 and then turn our work over. And now we're set up for row number 2. We need to find our slip stitch. That should be the very next stitch that we have available to work into. And it's easiest if we can flip it up so that we're looking at the V on the top, because we want to focus our attention on the back loop only. You'll insert your hook into the back loop of that slip stitch, and it may be a little bit tight. That's pretty normal for that stitch. And you'll single crochet there. Now the repeat for the gap sections here is really just to make one single crochet through the back loop only of every stitch for every row, and then we join it to the opposite side with a slip stitch. So in doing that, we're going to increase our stitch count by 1 each row. So I've made my first single crochet. I'm going to locate the next stitch, single crochet there for 2, 3, and 4. So I've increased by 1, just like I'm supposed to do. Then I'm going to look at the post from this first round. I'm going to skip the one that's next and slip stitch into the one right after that. Then our repeat continues. We're going to chain 1 and turn our work. Once you've worked that repeat several times, this is what the gap space looks like. We have a really cool ribbing texture here that we're playing with the single crochet through the back loop. And we have completely filled that gap so that we have a nice straight edge. That's sort of the goal that we're going for with filling these gaps here in the middle, is we want to have something that's nice and flat and easy for us to crochet a border. When you get to the end of your row here, when you only have a couple stitches remaining left to work into, we are going to, instead of skipping this last post and joining with a slip stitch to your chain 2 space, we're going to go ahead and work our slip stitch into that final stitch. And then we're going to chain 1, turn our work, and finish crocheting that last row. Now when you get to the end of this last row, we're going to do the same thing. Instead of skipping a post, in this case we would skip this one, and slip stitching to the chain 2 space, we're actually going to join with a slip stitch to that last double crochet. Once you've finished filling that gap, you've completed that final row, we can go ahead and fasten off. So we'll just take some scissors, trim the yarn, and then remember to pull the tail through the loop on your hook. So what you'll need to do at this point is fill all 4 gaps with this same method that we've just demonstrated here. And next, we're going to look at how to turn our corners into this overall rectangle that we're going for. If you spread your work out once you finish filling these gaps, you'll notice that our corners are missing. So we're going to see how to work those corners next. So once we have all of those middle gaps filled in, what we need to do is work on these gaps on this side. And you can see here, this is a little section that I have completed. And if you look at this, it's basically 1/2 of what we did here. So the technique is exactly the same, but there are a couple of things I want you to keep in mind in order to just have them turn out the right way. So the first thing you need to consider is which end you're starting on. We do want to start at this bottom corner right here. And of course we have to crochet from this side to that side. So that's going to determine whether or not you're going to have the right side of your work facing up like you see here, or the wrong side of the work facing up. So in this instance, I want to start down at this corner. And so in order for me to crochet up and over and then flip and over kind of in this direction here like we're used to, I have to have the right side facing up. And when you're working down at this end here, when we have the right side of our work facing up, I can see that I'm already going to be working backwards. I can't do that. And so what I'll need to do is flip it over so that the wrong side is facing up, and then I can start in that same place. Now, because this stitch pattern is reversible on both sides, it really doesn't matter. You're not going to tell the difference. So what we need to do to work these is, of course, grab some color B, create your slip knot, and then find your first post off of that corner. Insert your hook there, place the loop on your hook, then you'll just pull it through. We're just fastening on like normal here. I'm going to chain 1, but that chain 1 is not going to count as a stitch. So I need to work my first single crochet through the same place where I just fastened on, or in that same stitch. Now I'm going to look at the next post. I'm going to skip it and slip stitch in the one right after that. That completes our first row. So from here, we're going to chain 1, we'll turn our work, and then we're going to work through these back loops only, again, because we want to create that ribbing texture. I'm going to find my slip stitch and single crochet through that back loop, and single crochet through the back loop of that next stitch, which is the only one that I have remaining. So it differs on the side of our work here because we're cutting it in half, and that is going to be the end of our row. So what I'm going to do from here is chain 1, turn my work over again, and then I'm going to single crochet through the back loop of my first stitch. So these chain 1 at the beginning of the row, they're not counting as a stitch, so you need to single crochet through that first stitch. And then single crochet through the back loop of the next stitch. Find your next post and skip it, slip stitch to the one after that. And that's our repeat. We'll go through it one more time just so you can get the hang of it. We're going to chain 1, turn our work, single crochet through the back loop only of every stitch until we get to the end of the row. Then chain 1, turn our work, and work backwards. So 1 single crochet through the back loop only of every stitch until we run out. Find your next post and skip it, and then slip stitch in the next. So one other thing to keep in mind is that instead of increasing by 1 stitch every row or every time we slip stitch and kind of work backwards for those middle sections, it's not going to be the same here. We're going to increase by 1 stitch every other row, and that's because we just have a solid edge right here where we're not slip stitching to anything. So keep that in mind. Finish working your repeat until we get up here to the edge, and I'll show you how to fasten off, and we'll talk about what to do next. So once you've made it through all of that repeat, this is what your work looks like, and I want to demonstrate exactly how and where to fasten off. So I finished that row. I'm skipping a post, and I'm slip stitching into that last one there. And here's the point where we can fasten off. So go ahead and trim your yarn, and then pull that tail through the loop on your hook. Now you'll need to do this for all of the corners. So we'll have 2 on each side. And once you get finished with that, you should have all of your little gaps filled in. We should have a pretty rectangular shape here. But one thing I do want to mention is that it's probably going to be a little bit wobbly. Like you can see right here that this edge might not be exactly straight. So what I'm going to do is once I finish crocheting all of my corners, then I'm going to steam block. This is just really a quicker way to block your work. Now again, you can refer to that tutorial, BHookedCrochet.com/block your project. You can of course wet block this if you have the extra time to spare to allow it to dry. Otherwise, using a steamer, just what you would use for steaming your clothes, actually works quite well. So I'll pin it out, I'll use the steamer, and then I'm going to set myself up to work on these long horizontal rows. So let's see how to do that next. When you're ready to start your long horizontal rows, just choose one of the 2 sides and grab color A and create your slip knot. Then we're going to fasten on with the first stitch, and we're going to do so just in that back loop only. We're going to create a little bit of separation by working in the back loops only for this first row. And we have to start that off when we fasten on. Now go ahead and chain 1 to secure the join, but the chain 1 doesn't count as a stitch. What we want to do is single crochet in the same space, that same back loop, to create our first stitch. Now for the long horizontal row, we have sort of like a setup row first. What we need to do is evenly space 153 single crochet stitches from this side all the way to the other side. Now it works out to be pretty much one single crochet in every stitch. The variability comes in at the join, the junction between these little gap fillers and the motifs. Also keep in mind that as you're working this first row, we're going to work in the back loop only for every stitch, so that counts for these fillers as well as for the motifs there. Once you get to the end of that first setup row, so the first thing we're going to do is turn our work and chain 3. And this chain 3 counts as a double crochet. Then I'm going to skip the next stitch and work 2 double crochets in the next. Now skip the next stitch and 2 double crochets in the next. And that's our stitch pattern repeat. It's actually very simple. We are kind of offsetting our stitch count here because we're making 2 stitches into 1, but we're skipping 1 in between. And so that means that we aren't technically increasing or decreasing at all. We're just spreading the stitches out. Now we're just going to repeat this sequence until we get to the end of the row. And once you have 2 stitches remaining, I'm going to show you how to finish off the row because we want to make it match the other side. So we're going to do something just slightly different for that last stitch. Now if you counted your stitches correctly from our setup row, when you get to the end of your row, you've worked your last group of 2 and you should have 2 stitches remaining. So we're going to skip that next stitch and just make 1 double crochet in the last stitch. And that's going to finish off this row. Now as we move forward, the stitch pattern isn't going to change, but I do want to demonstrate the placement of our groups of 2. So to start off on the next row, we're going to begin by chaining 3. We'll turn our work. Again, that chain 3 counts as 1 double crochet. And then we're going to locate our first group of 2 double crochets. And that's where we're going to place our group of 2. So right in between those 2 stitches, you don't have to work in the stitch at all, just put them right in between. And when you do that, it sort of opens it up and makes it look like a V. So this is sort of like a modified V stitch. And that's our repeat. We're going to locate our next group of 2. You'll make 2 double crochets in between them, and you're just going to keep on going. Now as a reminder, when you get to the end of your row, you're just going to make 1 double crochet in your final stitch, and as you're finishing up this row, just keep in mind that your last stitch that you're going to work into could be a chain 3. So as we work through to the end of this row, our last stitch will be the chain 3 from our first row. So in that case, you're just going to double crochet into that 3rd chain, and that's going to finish off your row. So now all we need to do is repeat row 3 for our color pattern repeat. So we've started here with color A. We're going to work 5 rows with color A. Then we're going to switch to color B, work 5 rows of color B, switch back to color A, work 5 more rows of color A. Then we're going to fasten on color B, work 5 more rows with color B before finishing off with 1 row of color A. Once you get finished with that, of course you'll want to do the same thing on the other side to finish up your long horizontal rows. Now the next thing we need to do is weave in our ends and call it done. Once you have all of those color repeats taken care of, the last thing we need to do is some finishing techniques. So I'm going to point your attention to the little gaps that we see in between the two hexagons. We're going to take care of those first. So just thread one of those tails on your darning needle. And the first thing we want to do is run it from one side to the next. Now I'm just going to point out my chain 2 space, and that's where I want to join with my darning needle. Just run your darning needle through that chain, pull it nice and tight, and then find the next chain down, run it under there, and across to the other side. Now when you pull that tight, it'll gather it up, and just take your darning needle and just run it back around one more time just to secure things up. And now you can take a wet tail you have remaining and simply weave it in along this row of stitches. Well, there are a number of different ends that we need to weave in, and the techniques for weaving them all in are pretty much the same. So the idea is to find your tail. Of course, I'm just going to thread this on again. So right now I'm working on that very first tail where we made the first round of our hexagon. And the basic principle of weaving these in is finding a dense portion of stitches where you can weave it into. So anytime I'm working in a round, kind of like I am now, I'm going to go around in a circle as many times as I can for the tail. I mean, if you left yourself kind of a short tail, just weave it in as much as you can. And if you left yourself a pretty long tail, then go ahead and weave it around the circle at least twice. And then once you get that squared away, you can just trim that down and move on. Now we do have a lot of colors, a lot of tails to weave in over here on the side, and our technique for this is going to be pretty much the same. We want to make sure that we are isolating a dense row of stitches. The other thing we'll need to factor in though is our color. So I want to make sure that I am weaving in color B with color B and color A with color A, just so it doesn't stand out too much even though it is on the wrong side of the work. So you're going to go ahead and finish weaving in all of your ends for your entire afghan. And then my last tip for you is to make sure that you wet block the entire thing. Now the pattern actually looks quite cool with this sort of raw edge that we see along the side, but our hexagons do have a tendency to kind of scrunch in a little bit, and that's okay. We can correct that with wet blocking. We just want to stretch it out so that our middle section with the hexagons matches the same width that we see for our modified V-stitch section. So wet blocking is a great tool for that. You can check out that resource once again at BHookedCrochet.com/blockyourproject. If you are unable to wet block, if you don't have a surface large enough to stretch this out on, steam blocking will also be very helpful. Remember, if you have any questions whatsoever, I'm here for you, as well as hundreds of other yarn heroes. If you find yourself stuck at any point, leave your question in the comments section at BHookedCrochet.com/WUA Challenge 2018, or seek help from your fellow challenge participants on the Facebook event page. I want to say a big thanks to my sponsor, Yarnspirations, for helping me organize this event, and most importantly, a huge thanks to you for donating your time and effort in this challenge. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.